The judge yelled at her like she was nothing, but no one in that courtroom knew. She was a Navy SEAL, and she wasn't just trained to fight, she was trained to stay silent until it's over. That morning, she stepped into the courthouse without a word. No medals, no rank, just the quiet weight of someone who's seen too much and still chose to stand up. That morning, the air inside River County Courthouse felt heavier than usual. It wasn't hot, but it pressed down in a way that made people shift in their seats, glance around more than they needed to, and lower their voices without realizing it. And then she walked in. There was nothing about her that demanded attention. No security detail, no badge, no official title announced. Just a tall black woman in a plain navy blue suit, hair pulled back neatly, eyes calm and focused. She didn't look around the room like someone unfamiliar with it. She looked as if she had already read every corner of it. Twice. She walked with the quiet confidence of someone who had no need to prove anything to anyone. She didn't rush, didn't hesitate. She simply took her seat on the third bench to the left, folded her hands gently in her lap, and waited. To most in the courtroom, she was just another witness. She had come forward after a street altercation, a violent one involving two white officers and a teenage boy. She was the only civilian on the scene when it happened, and now she was here to testify. That's all they thought she was. What no one knew, not the bailiff, not the attorneys, and certainly not the man presiding over the bench, was that she had served more than a decade in the U.S. Navy. That for 6 of those years, she had operated in missions that would never appear in headlines, in places most Americans couldn't even pronounce. She had been a SEAL, and not just in title. She'd led, endured, lost, survived. And after the uniform, she didn't retire into comfort. She went deeper, into shadows where silence was more powerful than any weapon. But today, she hadn't come here to fight. She wasn't here to command or intimidate or correct. She wasn't wearing medals, and she wasn't going to raise her voice. She came to tell the truth. Nothing more, nothing less. But the truth has a way of making people uncomfortable. Especially those who've grown used to controlling the room. And the man sitting at the bench that morning had no idea that he was about to lose control of the courtroom, of the story, and maybe of everything that had once made him feel untouchable. Judge Harold Kramer had been on the bench for over 22 years, and in that time he had built himself a reputation, not for wisdom, not for fairness, but for being a man who didn't like being challenged. Especially not by people who looked like they had no business talking back. He had the kind of face that always looked like it had just smelled something unpleasant. A permanent frown creased his forehead, and when he spoke, it was rarely with curiosity, mostly with impatience. The courtroom stood as he entered, but even that small courtesy felt more like habit than respect. Everyone knew him. Everyone had heard the stories, the way he spoke to young black defendants, the smirks, the loaded language, the way he always seemed just a little more irritated when a witness came from the wrong side of town. He didn't look at her when he first sat down. He shuffled some papers, adjusted his glasses, then finally glanced toward the witness stand. "You ready, miss?" he asked, emphasizing the word like it tasted sour. "No, ma'am. No, miss. Just miss," tossed casually, like she was a waitress who'd overstayed her welcome. She didn't flinch, just nodded once. The judge leaned back in his chair and gave a thin smile. Not friendly, not warm. More like the smile someone gives when they're sure the game is already won. "Let's keep this short," he said. "We all know how these neighborhoods work." The air shifted. No one said a word, but it was felt. In the way the court reporter looked up from her keys, in the way the young lawyer next to the prosecution side blinked a little too fast. In the way the deputy at the door stopped tapping his foot. Still, the woman in the navy blue suit remained composed. Her expression didn't change. She was called to the stand. As she stepped forward, Judge Kramer didn't bother to read her name aloud. He just motioned to the seat and said, "All right, go ahead. What did you see?" She began calmly, laying out the time, the street, the sequence. Her voice was even, almost quiet, but not hesitant. She spoke like someone who respected the process, even when the process didn't respect her. But she barely finished her second sentence before Kramer cut in. "Miss, I asked what you saw, not a play-by-play. We don't need every detail." She paused, glanced toward him, and gave a single nod. then continued, just as before. He interrupted again. You seem to have quite a memory. Most people forget these things. She didn't answer that. Instead, she continued, recounting the moment when the boy was grabbed, the force used, how one of the officers struck him even after he was restrained. Kramer sighed audibly. You're saying you saw all that? From where exactly? Behind a car? Through a bush? With a telescope? The courtroom gave a few nervous chuckles, but they didn't last long. The tone wasn't humorous. It was condescending. Mean. She simply replied, I was 10 feet away. No obstructions. He rolled his eyes. All right. Just try to stick to what matters. No editorializing. There was no editorializing. Her words had been measured, precise. But that wasn't the point. The point was control. Judge Kramer wasn't interested in what she had seen. He was interested in how quickly he could put her back in a box, the one where women like her were supposed to speak softly, step lightly, and not correct authority. At one point, when she briefly hesitated, not out of uncertainty, but out of restraint, he leaned forward and snapped, Miss, if you're going to play the strong and silent type, this'll take all day. Either speak clearly or take a seat. Again, she didn't flinch. She looked at him for a moment, just long enough to register his face. Then nodded once and continued. No change in tone, no spike in emotion. Just stillness. And that stillness was louder than anything she could have said. Kramer glanced at the clerk, clearly agitated. He was used to witnesses cracking under pressure, getting flustered, raising their voices. But this one, she wasn't flustered. She wasn't impressed. She was calm, too calm. He mistook it for passivity. But what he didn't realize, what no one realized just yet, was that her calm wasn't surrender. It was observation, calculation. She wasn't reacting because she was already 5 steps ahead. The prosecutor adjusted his tie as he stood. Young, polished, maybe in his early 30s, but clearly still learning where confidence ended and arrogance began. He approached the witness stand with a file in hand, flipping through papers as if to remind her and the room that he held the facts. You say you witnessed the entire encounter? He asked, without lifting his eyes. Yes, she replied. And you're certain about what you saw? I am. He glanced up then, clearly ready to press. You testified that the first officer struck the teenager with his left hand, that he reached for his baton with his right, but used the opposite hand to initiate contact. She nodded. That's correct. He tilted his head, smiling faintly, as if he'd found the crack in her story. And how exactly did you determine that? In a high-stress moment? With people moving? Emotion involved? How do you know which hand he used? There was a brief pause. Not because she was unsure, but because she was choosing her words carefully. Then she said calmly, because I was trained to read micro-movements in a combat zone. The words didn't come out like a boast. There was no bravado in her voice. Just fact. Delivered with the same weight as saying the sky was blue. The room didn't gasp, but it shifted. The prosecutor blinked. A few heads turned. Even the stenographer looked up for half a second, as if questioning whether she'd misheard. Judge Kramer leaned forward. Combat? He said, the word almost bitter in his mouth. She didn't respond to him, not directly. She kept her eyes on the prosecutor, steady, unfazed. I watched the angle of his shoulders, she continued. The tension in his right arm versus the fluidity in his left. His dominant hand didn't lead the strike, his offhand did. It was quick, but not quick enough. The prosecutor tried to recover. So you're saying, what exactly? That you're trained to spot things normal people wouldn't? Yes, she said plainly. And where did you receive this training? She looked at him for a moment, not as a challenge, more as a quiet measure of who she was speaking to. In the Navy, she said. Special operations. There it was. 2 words. Simple, understated, but enough to drain some of the confidence from the prosecutor's face. Judge Kramer cleared his throat, louder than necessary. Let's stay focused, he snapped. This isn't a military hearing. You're here as a civilian. Let's not bring in dramatics. She turned toward him slowly. Not defiantly, not dramatically. Just enough to acknowledge his words and let the weight of her silence sit between them. The prosecutor, clearly trying to pivot, moved on. In your statement, you said the officer applied force disproportionate to the situation. On what basis do you make that claim? She didn't miss a beat. Based on standard rules of engagement, force escalation procedures. The boy was already restrained. The second strike was unnecessary and punitive. He narrowed his eyes. And you're saying this as a civilian observer? As someone who's been trained to de-escalate under fire? Again, no change in tone. Just that same unshakable calm. The prosecutor hesitated. He looked at Judge Kramer, almost as if asking for permission or rescue. But the judge had gone still, staring down at the file in front of him, eyes narrowed. There was tension now, not just in his voice but in his posture. This wasn't the kind of witness he was used to. He leaned in, voice sharp. "Miss, we're not here for a lecture on combat techniques. Just answer the questions you're asked. Keep the rest to yourself." She didn't move, didn't flinch. She simply replied, "Then perhaps ask better questions." The room froze. There was no gasp, no outburst, just stillness. And in that silence something shifted. The power dynamic, unspoken but deeply felt, had just tilted. Not through yelling, not through defiance, through clarity, through precision, through the kind of authority that doesn't need a title. For the first time since she entered the room, the judge blinked. Not out of irritation, but out of something else. Doubt, recognition, maybe even fear. Somewhere near the back of the courtroom, 2 rows behind the press bench, a man in a plain gray jacket leaned forward, phone cupped discreetly in his hand. He wasn't part of the legal team, didn't have a badge, didn't take notes, but he had been watching her, not with curiosity, but with a quiet recognition that suggested he already knew what she was capable of. He kept his voice low, barely more than a breath. "That's her, confirmed. Codename Blue Echo. She's on CIA reserve. Standing orders, observe, but don't interfere unless she signals." The person on the other end didn't respond. There was no need. He slid the phone back into his coat and sat still, like nothing had happened. Like he hadn't just identified someone who didn't officially exist. Up at the bench, Judge Kramer was still leaning forward, clearly agitated. He didn't like being talked back to, even when it wasn't really back talk. He didn't like calm under pressure, especially from a woman like her. And most of all, he didn't like not knowing exactly who he was dealing with. He masked that discomfort with more of the same. "Miss, let me remind you that this is a courtroom, not a military debriefing," he snapped. "We don't need tactical breakdowns or your combat resume, just facts and only what's relevant." She nodded once as she had done before, but this time she leaned slightly forward. "Understood," she said evenly, "which is why I'd like to submit supplemental evidence." There was a pause. Kramer raised an eyebrow. "Excuse me?" She reached down and lifted a small black case from beside her chair. Neatly, deliberately, she opened it to reveal a compact GoPro camera, the kind designed for field durability. "This was recorded from my vehicle," she said. "Dash-mounted, time-stamped, unedited." The prosecutor stood quickly. "Your Honor, we haven't been made aware of this footage," she interrupted him, not with volume but with clarity. "I've submitted the chain of custody report to the clerk this morning. It was also sent to the department's internal review unit. I'm offering it now because the court deserves to see what actually happened." Her tone wasn't defensive. It was tired, like someone who'd had to do this too many times in too many places for people who never expected truth to come from her mouth. Kramer hesitated, just long enough for the prosecutor to step in again. "We object, Your Honor. Without prior notice, we can't verify the source, and we can't cross-examine a camera." The comment earned a couple nervous chuckles from the jury box, but not from the woman in blue. She looked at the judge, not with challenge, but with something closer to warning. "The audio," she said softly, "includes verbal exchanges between the officers. One of them made a remark that I think this court would find relevant." Kramer narrowed his eyes. "What kind of remark?" She reached for a small playback device, handed it to the bailiff without ceremony. "I believe it speaks for itself." Kramer gestured impatiently. "Play it." A soft click, then static, then a voice. Male, sharp, close to the mic. "Don't worry about him, just another street rat. Say he reached for your belt if it gets messy." The voice of another officer, quieter. "Seriously?" "Yeah, you know how this goes. Clean it up." The silence that followed was suffocating. The courtroom didn't erupt, it froze. Even the prosecutor stopped shifting his weight. And then, a voice broke the stillness. Not from the stand, not from the defense table. From the second chair behind the prosecutor, a junior associate who'd been silent the entire time. A young lawyer, no more than 28, with tired eyes and a laptop open in front of him. He leaned toward his lead counsel and whispered something. The lead counsel ignored him. So the associate leaned back, typed something quickly, and opened a restricted database. One not meant for civilian lookup. His badge from a summer internship at the Office of Naval Intelligence still had back-end clearance. He typed her name. Nothing. He added more. Parameters, clearance levels, filters. Then something flickered. A trace. A mention in a long sealed operation report. Echo Unit, active counter-ops, unconfirmed assignment, Tier 1 reserve. His breath caught. That wasn't something anyone could fake. He looked up at her again. And suddenly, nothing about her calm felt ordinary. Everything, her stillness, her patience, her precision, made perfect sense. The moment the audio stopped, the silence didn't just linger. It thickened. You could feel it pressing into the walls of the courtroom, into the backs of people's throats. No one dared speak. Even the air conditioning seemed to hold its breath. Judge Kramer leaned forward, elbow on the bench, fingers pressed tight against his mouth. Then, after what felt like a full minute, though it was probably only a few seconds, he spoke. "Motion to strike that recording from the record," he said quickly, eyes locked on the clerk. "Unverified source, unsubstantiated. It does not meet admissibility standards." The clerk froze, unsure whether to act. The prosecutor hesitated too, his lips parted as if to support the judge, but no sound came. And then, her voice. Calm, clear, unhurried. "That video," she said, "is already in the hands of Homeland Internal Review." There it was, not shouted, not weaponized, just stated. And it hit harder than any objection. Kramer looked up sharply, and for the first time something in his face cracked. Color drained. He turned toward his aide, a man seated just to the side of the bench, usually quick to whisper reminders or slide documents forward. But the aide didn't move, didn't speak. His hands were folded in his lap, eyes fixed straight ahead. That silence, from the one man whose job was to protect the judge from slipping, said more than any verdict. Kramer cleared his throat, trying to gather himself. "That's not how this works," he said, his voice strained. "You don't get to bypass court procedure because you served somewhere. This is still my courtroom." She didn't reply right away. Instead, she folded her hands atop the stand, looked him dead in the eye, and said, "I've handled interrogation rooms tougher than this. You're just loud." The line didn't echo. It didn't need to. It simply landed, flat, heavy, inarguable. And the courtroom felt it. Not because it was defiant, but because it was true. Kramer shifted in his chair. The weight of the robe on his shoulders seemed to grow heavier. He opened his mouth, perhaps to threaten contempt, to reassert control, but the words didn't come. Instead, he reached for his water glass, took a sip, and set it down with slightly trembling fingers. Somewhere in the back, the young lawyer from earlier typed a single line in a message window on his laptop. "Judge losing grip. Witness. Credible, highly trained. Recommend internal observer." No reply came, but the message was sent. Kramer finally looked back to the woman on the stand. "You've made your point," he said, voice lower now. "But we don't determine guilt in this room through attitude. We use process. Protocol." She nodded once, as do I. There was no sarcasm, no spike of tone, just that same unshakable calm, the kind that doesn't bluff, doesn't posture, doesn't need to. The judge shifted again, looking down at the file in front of him, flipping pages not because he needed to, but because he needed something to do. A distraction, something to hold on to while the ground beneath his feet started to tilt. Because in that moment, whether he realized it or not, the courtroom was no longer his. Control hadn't been wrestled from him. It had simply drifted, not by force, but by presence. The judge called for a brief recess, 10 minutes. But it didn't feel like a pause. It felt like a retreat. People stood slowly. The quiet chatter that usually filled the courtroom during breaks never quite materialized. Even the journalists whispered differently, as if unsure whether what they were witnessing was still just a trial or the start of something else. She stepped out without a word. Not hurried, not tense, just purposeful. Once past the heavy oak doors, she walked a short distance down the corridor, past a bank of vending machines, and into a small alcove near the side exit. It was quiet there, tucked just enough out of view that she wouldn't be overheard. But that didn't matter. The number she dialed didn't belong to anyone who needed an introduction. The call connected after a single ring. A man answered, not brusque, not warm, just efficient. Go ahead, she spoke calmly. He's trying to bury evidence. Again. A pause. Then the man on the other end said, name, Kramer, Harold, county judge, river jurisdiction. Another pause. Then, with the ease of someone approving a supply drop rather than authorizing a legal nuke, you're green-lighted. Protect the record. Do it clean. Click. That was it. No hand-wringing. No long protocol checklist. Just permission. The kind that didn't show up in files, but moved faster than red tape ever could. She slipped the phone back into her inner coat pocket, exhaled once, and turned to head back into the courtroom. Inside, the mood had shifted again. The prosecutor was still standing with his team, whispering nervously over an open laptop. The young associate glanced up the moment she re-entered. He didn't smile, but he did sit straighter. She walked past the defense table, returned to the witness stand, and waited for the judge to resume the session. Kramer stepped in moments later. His face had recovered some color, but not composure. His robe looked heavier now, not because of fabric, but because of tension. He adjusted his microphone, cleared his throat. Before we proceed, he began, let the record reflect that the witness has introduced material that has not undergone full discovery. Given that, the court will. She raised a hand, not to interrupt, just to offer. From a document sleeve, she pulled out a single stapled report. Simple cover page, no color, no insignia, just an embossed code in the top right corner. She handed it to the bailiff without fanfare. This, she said, is a formal statement regarding the incident, filed under provisional protection with Homeland Internal Review. The file has been verified by internal systems and is subject to full federal record retention. The bailiff blinked, took the document with both hands, walked it forward. Kramer's eyes narrowed. What exactly is this? She didn't look at him. She faced forward. A sworn statement, time-stamped, geotagged, co-signed by independent witness attestation. It corroborates the footage, the audio, and the use of force violation. He didn't reach for it. Instead, he looked at the prosecutor's table, hoping perhaps for resistance. But the young associate was already leaning toward the lead counsel, whispering urgently. The lead frowned, looked down, then gave a tight nod. We accept the submission, the prosecutor said finally. A beat of silence. Kramer leaned back in his chair. You're implying federal oversight on a local court matter, he said slowly, as if testing how far he could push before the ground crumbled beneath him. She met his gaze evenly. I'm not implying anything, she said. The oversight's already active. It wasn't a threat. It wasn't even a warning. It was a fact, dropped into the center of the room like a stone in still water. The judge's eyes moved, to the bailiff, to his aide, to the hallway beyond the doors, as if searching for something he hadn't known he was missing until now. Support, control leverage, but what stared back was silence. The kind of silence that doesn't need to shout to win. It started with a buzz, not a dramatic one, not a gasp or a scream, just the soft vibration of a phone on a courtroom bench. Then another. Then the quiet, unmistakable click of a journalist sliding their finger across the screen to begin a live stream. Something was happening, something bigger than procedure. The judge hadn't said a word since her last sentence. The oversight's already active. He sat still, staring at the stamped report in front of him as if it had rewritten his job description. And in a way, it had. Because for the first time in his career, Judge Harold Kramer wasn't the one deciding what stayed in the room and what didn't. Then came the second wave. The court clerk, the same one who had been recording minutes without looking up all morning, suddenly straightened in her chair, eyes on her tablet. A file had just been received, anonymous sender, encrypted packet, audio file attached, no note, no source, just a subject line. You buried this once. Try again. The clerk hesitated, then tapped. A voice filled the courtroom. Male, familiar. Kramer. Look, if the witness can't get their story straight, that's not my problem. Just make sure the video doesn't surface. Chain of custody's a formality, not a requirement. Another voice, nervous, lower. But sir, they were willing to testify. Kramer again, sharper this time. Then make sure they don't. Delay the docket, reassign the case. You've done this before. Don't play righteous now. Dead silence. It wasn't a recent conversation. The quality of the recording was grainy, older, but the voice was unmistakable, and the timing, brutal. 3 rows from the front, one of the reporters lifted their phone higher. Live stream viewers were now in the thousands. Another journalist, sitting cross-legged on the floor, whispered into their mic, "What we're witnessing appears to be the unraveling of a sitting county judge. Live. This is no longer about a single testimony. This is about pattern, about power abused, and about someone who didn't blink when that power pushed back." Across the courtroom, the young associate who'd first looked her up earlier was now typing furiously. Each keystroke was a tiny act of documentation, of history being caught in real time. Judge Kramer finally stood. It wasn't graceful. He pushed back from the bench too hard, knocking his chair an inch off center. He grabbed the edge of the desk with one hand, papers trembling. This is inadmissible," he said, louder than necessary. "We don't validate anonymous files. This court has standards, rules." No one responded, not the attorneys, not the jury, not even the bailiff. They were no longer following his cues, because the room wasn't his anymore. And then she stood, slowly, not to shout, not to point, but simply to speak clearly and finally to everyone. 3 years ago, you suppressed video footage from a protest. A 17-year-old girl recorded it. You ruled it unreliable. Last year, a security guard submitted evidence from a mall incident. You sealed it before trial. This isn't new, Judge. This is routine. Your routine. But today, the routine ends. Kramer's face had gone pale. His lips parted as if to deny, to deflect, to defend, but nothing came out. She took one step forward, not toward him, toward the room. "You don't yell at truth, Judge. You protect it. And clearly, you forgot how. No applause, no gasps, just a shift, subtle, powerful, irreversible. Like the center of gravity in the room had moved." Kramer sank back into his seat, hands trembling faintly as he reached for the edge of the bench. The court reporter continued typing. The live stream viewers climbed past 15,000. Somewhere, a network producer was already preparing a headline. She didn't look back at him. She didn't need to. Because justice, real justice, wasn't in the verdict today. It was in the uncovering and in the silence that followed it. They didn't clap, no one stood, no one cheered. There were no raised fists, no shouted words of justice, no reporters crowding her with questions, just silence. The kind of silence that doesn't ask for a response. The kind that is the response. Judge Kramer didn't speak again. He remained seated, his hands folded tightly, eyes locked on the empty middle distance in front of him. The robe on his shoulders no longer looked like a symbol of authority. It looked like a weight he could barely carry. A court officer approached the bench and leaned in to whisper. Kramer didn't react at first. Then he gave a slow nod, almost mechanical. He reached for his gavel, then stopped. He didn't strike it. He set it down. And just like that, his session ended. Not by declaration, but by quiet removal. 12 minutes later, an official memo would be circulated. Judge Harold Kramer suspended pending investigation, effective immediately. But in that room, no one waited for the paperwork. They had seen enough. She stepped down from the witness stand with the same grace she had entered it, composed, quiet, unreadable. Her steps didn't hurry. Her posture never shifted. There was nothing triumphant in her walk, only steadiness. She passed the rows of benches without looking back, her shoes making soft, measured contact with the polished floor. The journalists parted as she moved, unsure whether to ask a question or just observe. It was the young associate, the one who had first found the fragment of her past, who finally spoke. His voice was barely audible, but she heard it. "Who are you really?" She paused. Just a beat, then turned her head slightly, her expression unreadable, and smiled. Someone who was tired of silence. She left the courtroom before the bailiff could finish calling the next case. Outside, the sky had shifted. It was late afternoon now, the light falling at an angle, casting long, slanted shadows across the courthouse steps. She didn't check her phone, didn't glance at the journalists behind her, didn't look back. Instead, she walked straight ahead, into a street that had no idea what had just happened inside that room, but one that would, soon. Some say she disappeared after that. No press conference, no interviews, no online presence suddenly uncovered. Just a name on a sealed report, and a memory in the minds of those who had witnessed her take a system built to silence people like her and answer it with quiet, undeniable truth. In a world full of noise and injustice, sometimes power wears a quiet uniform and watches from the back of the room. until it's needed.